Thank you all so much for coming, everybody. It really means a lot to see all of you here. There's lots of things that are competing for our time, especially this time of year. You chose to spend part of your evening with me, and over the next hour, I'm going to try to make it worth your while. I spent 6 years researching what you're about to hear, and I hope you find it as interesting as I have. So get in the car, kids, because we are going on a trip. We are going to the other side of the world, far into Eastern Europe. We are going to be zooming in on an area here called the Black Sea. Maybe some of you have heard of it. Maybe some of you have even been there. And there's this spit of land that's poking down into the northern part of the Black Sea, and that is called the Crimean Peninsula. And a lot of people hadn't heard of the Crimean Peninsula until just a few years back when the Russian troops marched in and stole it back from Ukraine. And then suddenly Crimea was on people's radars and it was getting some news time and whatnot, and more than like me had seemed to have heard of it. And as I zoom in here again, I'm going to direct your attention to kind of the south central area. And in particular, there is this capital city of Simferopol right here. And I am going to focus my attention on this rectangle of land just to the northwest of Simferopol, which corresponds to an American keyhole spy satellite image taken on October 4th of 1965. Now, American keyhole spy satellites took a lot of photos, but the thing that had Western intelligence analysts so intrigued about this one was not the lovely little arrangement of farm fields off to the right, but this town, which could not be found on any map and did not appear to have a name. I just happened to have on me a Crimean travel map from this exact same time period. So this is the kind of map that if you were on the go with your family in the car in Crimea, you stopped at a gas station, you needed a map, this is the kind of map you'd get. And that town should be right about there. But it's not. It's not on the map. It doesn't exist. It wasn't there. Well, today we know a lot more about this town, thankfully. For one thing, we know its name, and its name is Shkolnoye. And if anyone in the audience here speaks a little Russian, you may know that that is Russian for school. And indeed, the only thing that you could see of this town from the main road there in the upper right, the only building that you could see was and is a school with its ovalized running track. A real school with real students and real teachers who were really engaged in the business of learning and growing up. Now, past the school, there was a gate, and the gate looks like this today. It's a little rough around the edges, but back then it was patrolled by an armed guard. So we have this going on just west of the school. Now, past the gate, there was a long road that went up high over a crest and then down into a very low valley, which was where the rest of the town was constructed. And situated like this, in this arrangement of land, contoured like it was, all of the rest of the buildings were concealed from the main road. So this was a deliberate spot chosen for all of that. And at this point, it may occur to you that Shkolnoye was not so much about being a school or an educational institution. The name was a dodge. This was about being a Soviet military facility. I also happen to have on me a formerly top secret imagery interpretation report in which American intelligence analysts wet their pants trying to figure out what was going on at this place. So if we look up at the top, we can see that it's an imagery interpretation report. So they were working with keyhole spy satellite imagery, U-2 overflights, this kind of thing. They did not have people on the ground poking around. They just didn't have those resources. They didn't know what the name of the place was, so they just picked the next closest city name, which was Simferopol, and they knew it had something to do with space. And they knew this in part because looking at the imagery, they could see these arrangements of antennas, very specific types of antennas arrayed in a very specific fashion. So they knew it had something to do with space. They didn't know exactly what for. and they put the antennas on this map here that they were creating, and for all the attention, all the time that they spent trying to figure out this town, it's beyond me to understand how they got the map upside down, but they did, so we're just going to flip that around and make things right here. North is now up at the top. But the one thing that really had their noodles baked was this spot here, where the land was different. They weren't sure what it was. It wasn't a building. It was just an open plot that had been modified somehow, and they called it prepared area. But they didn't know what it had been prepared for what reason, why it had been prepared. They just knew that it was different. Well, I bet those intelligence analysts would have loved to have known back then that Shkolnoye was actually divvied up into 3 sections. And the first one, closest to the school, closest to the main road and civilization, was called the residential zone. So if you were a soldier stationed in Shkolnoye, you had a family, you were married, this is where you lived, this is where you went to the supermarket, this is where you looked at your shoes, and this is the actual Shkolnoye shoe store, and I look at this picture and I'm reminded of a Goodwill, I have to say. This is where you engaged in the local government-approved entertainment. And by the way, all of these pictures were taken by a soldier who was stationed in Shkolnoye by the name of Igor Smolin. And for reasons beyond me, why the soldier was allowed to carry a camera at a top-secret military installation in the late 60s and early 70s is way beyond me. I'm so thankful that he did, because it gives us this window into what this world was like. I'm really pleased to be able to say that Mr. Smolin furnished his entire photographic collection to me, and this Lunokhod talk that I do is the first time that these pictures have ever been seen anywhere. Past the residential zone, there was a gate. So now we get to the second one. Gate looks like this from the ground, and past it we went into an area where the soldiers mustered and received their instruction for the day. There was a shooting range in here so they could bone up on their skills. Lots of classrooms and administrative buildings where the soldiers met with their superiors and received political instruction and were disciplined. Cleaning, lots of cleaning happens in a military facility with the obligatory bust of Vladimir Lenin. If you were a single soldier, this is where your barracks were, so this is where you slept. This is where you engaged in some high-quality entertainment. And this is where all the soldiers took their meals. We are in the Shkolnoye administrative zone, but we're not all the way in. We don't even know what they're doing here. Okay, it has something to do with space, but what the heck's going on? Well, to find that answer, we have to go through this third gate. The gate looks like this today in a nauseatingly baby blue kind of color into the Shkolnoye technical zone. Antennas, you bet they had antennas. This one was their largest. It was 105 feet in diameter, fully gimbaled. They had much smaller arrays, rhombics and dipoles and all these different things. And this is where the power infrastructure for the antennas were. This is where they were controlled, where the data was received from them. This is where all the maintenance and repair happened on these antenna arrays. Shkolnoye was a Soviet space tracking station. There were 13 of these, very, very similar to each other, that were arrayed in a kind of a broad belt across the greater girth of the Soviet Union. 13 up in time for Sputnik 1 in 1957. That was later expanded to about 23. It's really analogous to today's Deep Space Network, which probably more of you have heard of, which has glorious around-the-world coverage. Soviets didn't exactly have enough friends back in the day to have around-the-world coverage, so one thing that they did do was modify ships to carry antenna dishes. Now, they must have had some smart naval architects, because that looks like it would just nose over, that it was just so top-heavy. But they worked, they would sail them in international waters, and they could increase their coverage. So, if there were 23 of these, how come I'm wasting all your time talking about this one? Why can't I get to the point? Well, to get that answer, we have to once again contemplate that prepared area and look at it in context of a 1968 selection that occurred. the heads of all of these different tracking facilities received a top secret telegram, because everything had to be top secret in the Soviet Union, summoning their best men, and they were all men, to a meeting in Moscow that turned out not to be a meeting at all when everybody walked into, the Institute of Biomedical Problems, and they got a health checkup. They got their tonsils looked at, and they got their dentition examined, and they had their respiration checked and their heart rates and all this stuff. And then the appraisals started to get specific and a little weird. They were examined for their reaction times and how quickly they could make decisions. And as time went on, the guys started to feel like maybe they were in the running to become cosmonauts, because there were all these crazy tests examining if they would freak out and how calm they could remain and all these things. And none of these guys were stupid, but the stupidest ones dropped out. And none of them were slow, but the slowest ones started to drop out. And 45 became 40 and 35 and so on. There was one test where they were put at desks in a classroom and a piece of paper was laid in front of them. They started looking at it, and then suddenly the piece of paper was taken away. And then the pop quiz started. Comrade candidate, would you please tell us what the meaning of the blue words were? Please, if you could repeat what the blue words were. And if you couldn't come up with the answer, you probably didn't stay in competition. The funniest test, in my opinion, was the men were taken one at a time to this deserted road on the outskirts of Moscow, and they were put behind the wheel of a Moskvich sedan and told to drive down this road at 10 miles an hour. This happens to be an actual 1968 Moskvich sedan interior, by the way. And they started driving down the road, and then people who were hiding in the bushes jumped out and threw dark blankets over the windshield. And then the guys were examined for how they responded. Did they freak out? Or did they bring everything down to a slow, controlled stop? Well, this process continued until 17 of the fittest, sharpest, and arguably best people remained. And that's when they got the shock of their lives, because they were taken all together now into an adjoining room, and presently a man stepped before them that none of them had ever seen before. The man, who was very elegantly dressed and dragging heavily on a cigarette, dispassionately explained that his name was Georgiy Nikolaevich Babakin, and he had a proposition for each and every one of them. Gentlemen, y'all think you may be in here, maybe getting ready to be cosmonauts? That's not happening. I'm really sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but you are not becoming cosmonauts. However, I've got something else that may be just as good, because the collective might of socialist labor has united to create an amazing machine, a car unlike any that has ever been seen before. This car, a car for exploring the surface of the moon. We call it Lunokhod, which, by the way, means lunar walker or lunar wanderer, depending on how you translate it. And all of you people have been chosen to be operators of the Lunokhod. How does that sound? I'm going to give you 10 minutes to make your decision. And he left the room, and everybody went, "Oh, we have 10 minutes to have smoke and then decide." And when he came back in, 3 people decided that they didn't want to have anything to do with this. It was just didn't sound good, and went back to their boring old jobs. So for the 14 who remained, Babakin said, "Okay, hey, thanks for staying. Really need you. So maybe you're all kind of ticked off that you're not going to become cosmonauts and whatnot. However, I still think of you in very high terms, because you will be exploring uncharted regions, places on the moon that have never been seen before, and you will be doing it in real time. And this is why I think of you as my sitting cosmonauts. You are a group of people, you will work in multiple shifts, but I still think of you as cosmonauts in my head." And with that, they went out to the barren steppes in Siberia to examine the operations of an engineering model of the Lunokhod rover on a simulated terrain out on the volcanic plateaus there. And they started to understand how the work was going to be performed. So it would be 2 teams of 5, which would each be operating this rover, and then there would be 1 guy in reserve. Now that only adds up to 11, because near the end of training there were 3 more guys who decided, you know what, I think I've had enough of this crazy moon car stuff. I think I'm ready to just go home and go to the ballet and listen to bad radio and be done with this. So that left 11 holdouts, and the team would not change after that. So they got on a tumble-down bus and rolled into Shkolnoye. So this would have been approximately their first sight as they entered the residential zone, courtesy of glorious, crappy Soviet photographic film. So this road here, this is the one that came up over the rise and down into the low valley. And this would have been approximately their first view of the Shkolnoye technical zone. So this is late 1960s right here. You couldn't see it in that previous picture, but there was a white two-story L-shaped building very close to that main antenna dish, which was already used to receive data from the antenna dishes. So there was an excellent infrastructure of power and communications and whatnot. So this building was commandeered as the Lunokhod Control Center. It never had an official name or an official number or anything like that. It was just the control center. And there were rooms that were established for meetings and for rest. And of course, there would be a very special room in which the drivers themselves worked. Just to the south of it was that prepared area, a hectare's worth of ground where the native Crimean grasses had been stripped back to bare soil, multiple craters dug, about 56 in total, different sizes, shapes, and whatnot. And then it was carefully covered over with black dyed dirt, rocks, and dust, ladled out very carefully, groomed with all the care and attention given to that of the Sai Gardens. They called it the Lunadrome, and this was the mock landscape from which that engineering model of the rover would be driven in the building just to the north of it. I'd like to give you a quick tour of the rover itself here, and the first thing that you might notice when you look at this picture is how honkin' big it is. So let's think for a second about the American Mars rover. So in 1997, we had one called Sojourner that was the size of a microwave oven, and that was a pretty big deal at the time. And then in 2003, we sent off 2 more that were each the size of riding mowers. But here, in 1967, we have something that is the size, shape, and approximate weight of a classic Mini, an Austin Mini. 1,600 pounds worth of rover. You could have put 4 people inside this thing. The next thing you might consider as you look at this is how gosh darn ugly it is. So this, everyone, is classic Soviet additive engineering. We are not going to seek out a single elegant solution to some design problem like the jolly old American dogs would do. We are going to start with what we know and then keep bolting on stuff until we've overcome that problem. So you know how to make something, and you know how to make something, and so do you. We're going to bolt those together and keep adding stuff until we have a rover that works. So we can first look at this tub and say, well, you know, the Americans never had a tub. Why do we have a tub, or a baby carriage, some people call it? All kinds of nicknames been hung on this thing. And the tub was there because Soviet electronics of the time were not very good. In particular, they did not work well in an open space environment, in a vacuum. They would fail. They just didn't work. And so the solution on the part of the engineering staff was to send Earth's atmosphere to the moon. So this was pressurized to one Earth atmosphere, and the electronics, for all they knew, were just happy and comfortable and cozy in this because it was just like being back home in beautiful Moscow. That's why there's a tub. It's because the Soviets were never able to make it work in an open space environment. Up in front here, we've got a couple things that look like portholes, and they are actually navigation cameras. Fairly low resolution. You wouldn't use both at the same time. They're not in stereo. It's just one's there in case the other one fails. These would be used by the operations team to look ahead and see what's coming on the surface. However, on the side, we had these high-quality panoramic cameras. So they kind of look like soup cans. It's a little hard to tell in this picture, these big silvery soup cans. But the one that's pointing up, it would image 180 degrees front to back. Took about 20 minutes. And then the one that's laying on its side, it actually imaged a full 360 degrees all the way around. And then there's this white can underneath here that had a little bubble inside and a marble, which would show what the lunar vertical was. So when it scanned down, they could catch that too. Then up top here, we've got this thing that, you know, it may remind you of, you know, that thing that James Bond got threatened with in the Goldfinger movie. There's actually no weaponry that was on the Lunokhod rover. This is actually just a high-gain antenna, a steerable high-gain antenna. And then on the back, kind of toilet seat lid style, we have an arrangement of solar cells on a lid. And they provided about 180 watts of power. So I think of that in terms of light bulbs worth, so that's about 2 light bulbs worth. So we have 2 light bulbs worth of energy that are powering a 600-pound rover remotely across the surface of the moon. The lid did a couple of things in addition to supply power. During the day, the 2-week lunar day, there's a problem because we have hot electronics, inefficient electronics, and this thing is going to cook if you can't shed the heat somehow. So the top of the tub was actually a giant radiator, and there was a cooling gas that was circulated via fans inside the Lunokhod tub, and so with that lid open, you could transfer the heat out of there fairly simply. But at night, we've got the opposite problem. We need to keep things warm on the inside because it is going to be very, very cold after the sun goes down on the moon, and then it's down for 2 stinking weeks. We have silver cadmium batteries on board with a liquid electrolyte. That's going to freeze. The wiring insulation is going to become brittle and possibly crack. So they can close the lid at night, and that helped to lessen the speed of the heat loss. But it wasn't going to be enough. So once again, very rough and ready Soviet way of overcoming a problem with brute force. What they did is on the back of the rover, they bolted on a 24-pound chunk of radioactive polonium. Now, this stuff is pretty nasty, as I'm sure all of you know. It is so bad that it can kill telemarketers. But one thing that it does do is it gives off a lot of heat. And so if we kind of take a peek at the inside of the rover, we have this assembly of radiators, and there's 3 fans driven by the batteries that were always running. And at night, a baffle would open, and the cooling gas would be circulated past that polonium where it would get heated, and then the fans would pull it through the belly of the rover. And this is what kept it warm at night. Not bad, I'd have to say. The development effort for this thing took place in 2 major pieces, so we want to split these. There are some, you think about like the Mars rover today, and there's like 20 subcontractors or whatever on the Mars rover. There was basically 1 major subcontractor here. So the body, the tub, along with the integration of the science instruments, that came together down in a suburb of Moscow at a place called the Babakin Design Bureau. But the chassis came together at, of course, it was top secret, yep, Soviet, top secret, at a place up in Leningrad, today it's called St. Petersburg, in a suburb of Leningrad called Georgiy, at a place called Institute 100. They did a lot of mobility research, and it wasn't their only product, but their biggest product was they used to make tanks. And during World War II, the Soviet government had come to be very thankful for them going to the trouble of making such good ones. And indeed, during the siege of Leningrad, it was actually not uncommon for Institute 100 tanks to roll out the factory gates and go around the corner and immediately on up to German positions. That's how close things were during the siege of Leningrad. After the war ended, they still continued to make tanks, and they were able to improve on their designs somewhat. But one thing that they did spend some time on was the synthesis of a tank with a hovercraft. And they spent years on this and could never quite balance out the competing requirements. We needed to be light, but we need to carry all these arms and armaments and whatnot. And so the project was eventually abandoned, partly because of logistics reasons, partly because the Lunokhod opportunity came along. This is the only picture I've ever seen of the prototype hover tank undergoing some trials. And the man at the center of this picture was one of the lead engineers on the hover tank, and his name was Israel Rosenzweig. I'm very, very pleased to be able to report that Mr. Rosenzweig told me his story. I'm the only person he has ever told me his story to. It was so hard to crack this shell that was the people who worked at Institute 100, especially as an American, especially as someone who doesn't speak very good Russian. But Mr. Rosenzweig opened up to me about creating this project, what it was like going through the engineering effort, dealing with the Soviet brass, what he ate, how he slept, what his wife thought of it, and what it was like to live and work in the Soviet Union as a Jew. Mr. Rosenzweig, happy Hanukkah. A lot of the pictures and detailed information you're going to see come from people like Mr. Rosenzweig, so I try to call them out when I can. This is one of their early prototypes, so they had some basic command and control systems underneath the turtle shell, but they were playing around with mobility, and they weren't sure if they wanted to go with a wheeled vehicle or if they wanted to go with tracks. They knew crawler tracks. They were tank builders. And so a lot of people really favored those right at the outset. Now, there were some downsides, of course. They were heavy, they were more complicated, and if you got stuck, there wasn't going to be a soldier who could just jump out the top with a Craftsman socket wrench and make everything right again. So it was going to be difficult. They experimented with hybrid solutions like this one. So we've got a mini crawler track, maybe closer to the size of a wheel. What if we use multiple ones of these, and then if one failed, we would have some others that they can rely on? One day comes along and they're testing this chassis. And they had dug this mock lunar terrain, and they were kind of seeing how the wheels handled it and everything. They had some fault protection they were working on. But on this particular day, somebody had managed to get their hands on a Japanese video camera. And they put it up on top, and they led power and signals back over to where the guy was with the joysticks driving it. And they plopped the TV on there, tube electronics warmed up, and they could see a picture. And something happened that nobody had anticipated. When that camera went up on top, suddenly they could see it. They could see this machine, this lunar rover in their mind's eye. And at that point, it became very real. No matter what kind of chassis or wheel or track design they experimented with, the good ones, the top candidates, went on to this custom-built test track that they had built inside one of their assembly bays. Tanks out, fake lunar surface in. So the chassis would go around the far perimeter, and then operators would ride in this rail car with a set of umbilicals arcing on over, and they could drive this thing in an endless loop all day and night to see how it behaved, how it handled, how it stopped, all these good things. What did they decide to go with? They decided to go with wheels. How do you build a Lunokhod wheel? You build it like this. You take 3 titanium hoops, 20 inches in diameter. The middle one is going to be a little bit larger in diameter, so you get this nice peak and cross section. We're going to make these hoops just a little bit elastic, like 12, 15% elastic, which is going to increase the ground contact with them. We're going to cover them with a mesh, 0.5 millimeter diameter steel wire woven into a 3.5 millimeter grid mesh. That gets riveted down by way of these traction cleats. You put the cleats on there, this kind of starts to look like a farm tractor tire, in my opinion anyway. People ask me what the holes are for. They're to save weight. 16 off-the-shelf bicycle spokes from a bicycle plant come down from the hoops and lace into this central flange. We're going to take 2 of these wheels and put them together in a pair. We're going to have these torsion arms that lead from the wheel hubs to a central carrier, and then we're going to bolt those onto a pan that goes underneath the tub. That's how you build a Lunokhod chassis. So very simple, very reliable, very rough and ready. I mean, there's nothing too terribly fancy about this, although I would like to take a second and talk about the hubs. Some people look at that tub and they think that there was an engine in there or something, like this was a Ford pickup truck. Actually, each of the wheels had its own motor in the tub. The motor was right here, 2 Newton meters worth of torque on each motor. In front of it was a brake, which actually had to be added very late in the game because they thought that when they just turned off the motors while they were driving, that the friction would just stop the wheels, and it didn't. But everything else had already been manufactured, and they said, oh crap, we need to put a brake in here. So they added this metal plate that looked kind of like a flattened donut. Electromagnetically actuated, 2 amps of power would scream through this motor and tug on this plate and lock it hard to the motor, and that's what would stop things. In front of it, we have a set of planetary reduction gears. carefully machined to give us the ultimate granny gear. So it's that really small chain ring on the front of your mountain bike that's going to enable you to ascend a steep slope. And in front of that, we have explosives because the wheel might get stuck on the lunar surface. And then you have a very serious problem because you just can't ask your buddies to come along and push it out. So what would happen is if all other options had been exhausted, you had nothing left to do but set off the explosives, you'd send the signal through, it would obliterate these planetary gears, which would then fall out through this hole that had been carefully machined in the front of the hubs, and this would forever render that wheel a passive roller. Now, what good is that, though? Well, the specs on the Rover wheels were so good that you could actually lose 4 whole wheels on this thing and still drive. That's one of the big reasons that it had 8. Only the Soviets would tack on 1-to-1 spare wheels on a lunar rover. My favorite thing about the wheel hubs, though, is how they lubricated those reduction gears. And maybe it sounds like a silly thing to talk about lubrication in a space talk, but whatever. So you've got a big problem, though. You've got gears, metal gears, that are gnashing together in a vacuum. And if you spritz WD-40 down into those teeth, it's just going to evaporate. If you smear it with Valvoline, fully synthetic wheel bearing grease, it's not going to last. So we've got a serious problem here. Well, the wizards at Institute 100 came up with something that absolutely blew my mind. They got their hands on this very, very high quality alloy of iron that was called C5. And while it was still molten in the furnaces, I don't know how they got this idea, but they sprinkled in powdered glass. And then they let everything cool, and they machined the gears out of it. And when they would gnash together in a vacuum, they would heat up, and the heat from this action would melt the glass and provide the lubrication. Liquid glass lube. You can say what you want to about Soviet technology. We can make fun of their crappy stereos and their slow computers and their ugly cars, but liquid glass lube kind of blows me away. After all of those problems were sorted out, the wheels were bolted onto the chassis, and the tub and chassis finally met at the Babakin Bureau in Moscow in late 1967. And everybody thought they would have their own sweet time to get the kinks out of this thing. And then something pretty nasty was done by the Americans. They flew a mission called Apollo 8. And for those of you who aren't familiar, this was the first time humans left the gravitational influence of Earth, and they went out and they orbited the moon on Christmas Eve. And at that point, the Soviets knew that it was game over as far as the moon race went. They knew they had lost. And lots of people think it was Apollo 11, and it wasn't. It was Apollo 8. It sent the Soviet hierarchy into a tailspin, trying to figure out how they could respond to it. And somebody said, well, hey, don't we have some kind of like moon car in development? Yeah, we do. Okay, let's use that. Because at this point, they need to come up with some sort of technological spectacular that will impress the world and somehow take some of the shine off of Apollo 11 that was coming up later on in the year. So in February of '69, they flew their first Lunokhod, and it was not this one. During the ascent to orbit, the nose shroud stripped away, and it obliterated the launch rocket. It exploded into a gazillion pieces. There were actually soldiers who were sent out into the Kazakhstan steppes to try and find that 24-pound chunk of polonium. They weren't told what it was. They were told to look for melted snow around a piece of metal laying out there. If you see melted snow, call us. And they never found it. But in the fall of 1970, they actually did get one of these guys down and safe in the Sea of Rains. So it was in this approximate area right here. Why there? Primarily because it was safe. A crashed rover does not do you very much good, even if it happens to crash in the most interesting part of the moon. So now that this thing was down, now that it was upright and operational, the secret could be made public. So it landed on the 17th of November in 1970. This is the front page of Pravda the next morning. Pravda means truth. And here we have this headline and even a schematic drawing of the rover on its landing platform. It says, "Работаем на Luna," which means working on the surface of the moon. And it started doing exactly that. It rolled down from its descent stage, it pointed that high-gain antenna towards the Earth, and then it took off on an amazing voyage of discovery. And it actually worked for an incredibly long time. It worked for 10 months. That's 10 lunar days. So it survived 10 of these freeze heat cycles. And the engineers who built it, Rosenzweig and all of his colleagues, they thought they'd get maybe 90 days out of it, but they got 10 months. Not bad. They covered a lot of ground, they took a lot of measurements, and the thing didn't stop until that can of polonium was no longer keeping the insides warm enough. I mean, it's so hot, the decay, the half-life, it's going to be pretty short. And so that's what finally brought this rover to its knees, is it could no longer keep itself warm at night. However, before the mission ended, this is one of my favorite panoramic photographs from the mission. There's two of them here. So there was this grand circuition going southwards in this big southerly loop where they drove around almost 5 miles and came back and they found the landing platform. So no map here. So this was just relying on the instrumentation in the rover and the smarts of the crew to actually navigate back after months at a time and find the landing stage again. Pretty impressive. Oh yeah, the crew. So you may have remembered me saying it was going to be a team of 5 that operated this thing. And some people have said to me, well, hold up. So are you telling me that you would need 5 whole guys to steer this thing? Isn't there just one joystick? Isn't it just that simple? Isn't it just like a video game? Don't you just have a driver? Well, yes, there was a driver. This is my man, Vyacheslav Dovga, and I'm proud to say that he's alive and well. I just emailed with him the other day. He very kindly answered all of my questions. We had some wonderful conversations about what it was like to be selected for the Lunokhod drive team, to endure this weird training, and then to participate in these missions. Quick tour of his console here. You can see that he's got an actual joystick. If the joystick fails, once again, Soviet electronics, he's got a panel of buttons there on the extreme right that could actually move the rover if the joystick failed. There were also some pre-programmed moves in there like stop, turn left 5 degrees. And then he's got these arrows pointing in cardinal directions with this 2x2 grid of lights that would show him which wheel motors were engaged on the rover and which direction it was going. And then over on the left, we have these oversized needle gauges, which were showing to what degree the rover was pitching forward or backward, and what degree it was going side to side. And it could go 20 degrees up or down, and up to 45 degrees on either side before the fault protection would kick in and it would come to a stop. And after the mission was over, all of that data was plotted out to give us this contour map of the lunar surface. So it's data that's still used today. He's got this TV screen in the middle, and I don't know how you can see in this terrible lighting, but there's 2 lines that kind of converge in this isosceles triangle kind of shape, and those indicated the wheel tracks, so where the wheels would be as he progressed forward. And then we have some graduated lines here which indicate 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, because it was really hard to gauge distances. You've got these cameras which are kind of at lap height. It's kind of like crawling through tall grass trying to see the horizon. It's pretty tricky. And then at the same time, those of you who may think that he had full motion video running up into this thing, no. He got a picture every 20 seconds. So imagine me just trying to walk to this podium, and I'm going to walk at 0.8 kilometers an hour, which is approximately Lunokhod's first speed, and I can open my eyes and take a quick blink every 20 seconds, and that's it. So this isn't driving via video remote. This isn't like operating a Predator drone. This is like a film strip, actually. Second person on the team was the flight engineer. I searched my photos trying to find a good picture of a flight engineer at his console for you. These are the 2 engineers down here. I could never find a good picture of him, but I found a good picture of his console, which was like a bad Soviet Radio Shack TRS-80 computer or whatever. And basically, he was monitoring all of the systems on the rover, its temperatures, its pressures, its voltage levels, how well the batteries were charging, all this kind of stuff. So he was kind of the early warning system when noticing when things started to go wrong. And he used that in conjunction with this panel up here, which didn't have any controls on it. It was basically just a status panel for every single little system on the rover. We've got a separate status light for each one of the wheels, for all the different systems, for all the individual batteries. That was the flight engineer. Third person, radio operator. So once again, he's operating the James Bond death ray, keeping a lock on Earth with that rover antenna. You need one guy to do just that? Well, yeah, we've got a low gain antenna, which is the upside down ice cream cone there, but the higher the quality of the radio signal, as I'm sure you know, the higher the quality of the panoramic photographs, the less errors that are going to be in the data. It's just going to be clean signal all the way around. So here we have Nikolay Kozlitin, who unfortunately is no longer with us, and he is at the controls of the radio operator's console. Today that thing is in a museum, and we can take a peek here, just kind of get a quick tour. He's got some needle gauges over here, but they are telling him in what position the antenna is. Its elevation, its azimuth. Then up here, he's got a serious game setup going because these are showing the signal strength for the high and low gain antennas. And so he's trying to get that needle slammed up to 10 as often as he can. And so he uses these buttons on the far right to play the game of trying to keep the needle slammed up. He's got a TV monitor, the same as Dovgan has next to him. And the way these buttons work, we've got left, right, up, down, okay? So those will slew his antenna 5 degrees in any of those directions. And then the 3 buttons right here will go 5 degrees, 20 degrees, or 180 degrees. I kind of wish the guy had a big knob like in the old Breakout video game or something that he could rock back and forth. But instead he had these buttons. I don't know, maybe they could never make the knob work. But that was the radio operator. Next person on the team, the navigator. So we aren't just going to drive along. When we come to a crater, when we come to a feature, we are going to stop and map it. We are going to estimate the size of that. We're going to try to figure out the size of the rocks and the stones around it. And we're going to create these high-quality maps of the lunar surface. So the 2 navigators often work together. This man right up here was named Boris Napoleonov, who also unfortunately is no longer with us. He was the head of the science team, and he had a map-making background, kind of later transitioned into being something of a geologist. But for this very first mission, he was the only scientist who was allowed inside the crew room and helped direct the operations, which was really something of a thorn in the side of the roomfuls of other scientists who basically had to wait their turn to run an experiment or whatnot. Last person on the team is the head honcho, commander. So he would take all the information coming in from everybody else and synthesize all of that into a decision. So we very much have a mission control type of atmosphere going on here, where everyone reports in. Are there critical things? Are there not so critical things? We are truly going to work together to make a decision as a whole, because that sunlight, maybe that in front of us is just a shadow, maybe it's actually a crater that we can fall into. We need to know that when Dovgan grabs his stick and thrusts it forward, that we are proceeding with confidence, that we are making a move as a group here. One of the amazing panoramas from Lunokhod 1, one of the crew members told me that they were prospecting along for so long at one point, it was like a 10-hour session or something, and his mind transitioned to the state where he almost thought he was inside the tub of Lunokhod, looking out through those portholes. And they came out from this communication session, and they were having a break, and he comes walking outside. They've been at it for 10 hours, and he looks up, and there's the moon. And he can see the Sea of Rains where his rover was right then and there. And he looked up at it, and he was mad. He said, "I was just there." A few other details about the crew. They all wore these ugly, lightweight blue jogging suits, and underneath each one was kind of this bra of sensors that measured like heart rate and respiration and sweat level and all this stuff. And all that was telemetered, did I even say that right? Down the hall to a couple of doctors who sat there monitoring all this stuff. And it seemed after about 2 hours or so that the crew, they would be getting short with each other, or they would have just stopped talking completely and are no longer communicating. Their heart rates are up, their sweat levels are up, they're very visibly tired. And the doctors would knock on the door and say, hey, we need to change. So those 5 would come off shift, the other guys would rotate in, and then the guys coming off, they had their own separate break room where they could have snacks and drinks and that sort of thing. One thing that I heard from one of the science team members was that the crew who were just coming off shift, they were provided these oxygen cocktails, which were glasses of water that had oxygen bubbled through them, and it would supposedly like revitalize them and invigorate them, and they would just be able to recover so much faster. And everybody kind of knew that it was really just a gimmick. Even while Lunokhod 1 was on its way to the moon, Lunokhod 2 was under construction. And the engineers knew that they had a little bit more weight to play with, so it got a little heavier. They were able to slightly improve the resolution and the refresh rate on these front-mounted nav cams, but they also added a third one that was more at a person's standing height to help try and eliminate some of these problems that they were having with the position of the other 2 cameras. Lunokhod 2 came down in Le Monnier crater at the Sea of Serenity, this time in a spot that was very carefully chosen. The idea of having quality science was something that was very slow in coming to the brass who approved all of these things, like Lunokhod missions. And the geology team harped on them enough where they finally got to land here, and I'm going to zoom in. This is the southern rim of the crater. And so Lunokhod 2 came down right about here. Once again, nice, flat, smooth pancake. But as soon as we're down and safe, we're going to head south, and we are going to explore this transitional zone between the mare that are nice and flat and the lunar highlands, and see if there's anything cool there that's never been seen before. Once we get past there, we are going to head out east and head for this giant fault line called Fossa Recta, and we're in search of 2 things. We're in search of lunar outcrops and possibly lunar bedrock, pieces of the moon's original crust. They made it all the way to Fossa Recta, even though the rover did not last as long. So if you take a peek at these stats here, it didn't go for nearly as long, but it covered a lot more ground. And it ended very suddenly. And I take pity on the person who had to call up Premier Leonid Ilyich at his dacha and explain that Lunokhod 2 was unfortunately no more. But what had happened was a serious sense of complacency and a seriously poor understanding of what really should be accomplished on these missions. This right here was Colonel Bugayev, and he ran the Shkolnoye facility. And every time people wanted to run a science experiment or take a high-quality panorama, they had to stop Lunokhod. There was an X-ray spectrometer down on its underside, and you sort of had to park over the area you wanted to examine, and you'd be there for half an hour at least. And Bugayev came in more than twice and banged his fist on the table in the crew room and said, "Gentlemen, Lunokhod is not Luna stop. We need to show that it is moving, so you will be moving." So there was this political pressure to barrel forward at the expense of science, at the expense of examining what's around you. And the crew, they made mistakes. I don't know how else to tell it. I have such enormous respect for those guys, but they bowed to the pressure, and I really think that contributed to them making mistakes. So they were driving along east of Fossa Recta, and they get stuck in this crater. And I call it the Goldilocks crater because it wasn't too big, and it wasn't too small. It was just the right size to swallow up a Lunokhod. And I chose this picture on purpose so you can see just how long this thing is when the tail is open all the way, this big beaver tail of an appendage. It's almost doubling the length of the rover, and it's shifted all the way to the back wheels. And they were so afraid of losing power that they kept the lid open. And they were so afraid of getting stuck in there forever that they just started going back and forth, like they were in some really tight parking spot, trying to get the heck out of this thing. And while they were slewing around, they should have closed the lid, they should have stopped, taken panoramic photos. They didn't do any of that, they just wanted out. And at one point, they backed into the side of the crater and dirt got scooped up and spilled all the way down the front of the lid. The power output dropped, the rover was still operating, but at that point, everybody knew that this thing was doomed. They were able to get out. It took a few more hours, and they had a few more Earth days in the 2-week lunar day. But when the sun started to go down on the lunar surface, what were they going to have to do? Close the lid. Lunar soil is a magnificent thermal insulator, and when they did so, the soil got spread all over the top of that radiator. And it was fine for the lunar night, but when the morning came and they were going to open it up, it would only last a couple of days before it overheated and it died. And that's why the mission ended so much sooner than Lunokhod 1. There was a Lunokhod 3 that was built because of political reasons. It never flew. They were actually planning to have a robotic arm on it that could gather samples and then take them to a sample return craft. Soviets are still the only ones that have ever returned material from any other body in an automated fashion. But it never flew, and today it's sitting in a museum. And I never complain about seeing models in museums. I love seeing models in museums, but when I'm seeing actual flight hardware in museums, it really makes me sad because that stuff shouldn't even be here. It should be on the moon, but it never went. Today, you look at a map of Shkolnoye, and guess what? It's on the map. If you go there, there is a bus stop and a road sign, and the school is still there. This is a view from the roof. School's actually alive and well, I'm happy to say, with real students and real teachers who are still there. So if we look at Shkolnoye overhead today, east of the technical zone, it's actually a thriving little suburb of Simferopol, which is just 15 minutes down the road. There's even some new construction that has happened here. We've had some apartment blocks go up, some individual homes and some shops and whatnot. And it's a lovely little bedroom community for Simferopol. But if you go through that third gate and you go around the corner, past the area where Mr. Smolin's fellow comrades used to patrol, you enter a wasteland. Because what happened? In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Ukraine got Crimea, which had 2 space tracking facilities. Well, Ukraine, I mean, they don't have a space program, so they kept the nicer one, just for yucks. And in 1996, they closed the Shkolnoye Technical Zone, and in 1998, they formally abandoned it. And today, some of the barbed wire is still there. You can walk right up to it in these very areas where the soldiers used to patrol and practice with their rifles. You can duck through that barbed wire and look at the interesting frescoes that formerly only the people with the top secret clearance could go through because we were inside 3 guarded gates and a hush-hush town left off the map. This is my favorite decoration right here, is this clock tower. We go inside this building, though, and we find emptiness. I mean, these formerly pristine facilities that were so carefully maintained by all of the soldiers there, and there's just nothing left. Everything of value stripped out, all the windows are smashed, everything's looted. This is what we would today call a data center. It was a hub of this building for power and communications and whatnot. That big 105-foot diameter dish is never going to move again because all the power modules and all the cabling that ran it, they've been stripped out. These 2 guys actually climbed up inside the dish. I like this one because it is the last picture that I know of that shows the Lunokhod Control Center intact and an overgrown, sadly overgrown Lunadrome just to the south of it. This was what the Lunokhod Control Center looked like in 2009. The crew room for the Lunokhod drivers was literally gone. And today, there's nothing left. Ukraine was knocking it down. To me, this would be like knocking down Apollo's mission control facilities. Think of all the history in here, everything that happened. This could be a tourist attraction. And instead, it turned into a junk pile. Well, Ukraine, they had their priorities in order, I guess, and one thing that they needed more than anything else was concrete. And so they were knocking down these buildings in the abandoned technical zone so that they could reprocess the building material into concrete so that they could improve the roads. I hate to end on a down, but I guess I am, so thank you for visiting Shkolnoye. And I do have a parting gift for anyone who's interested. I have these sitting cosmonaut badge ribbons, which are free for the taking. They look great if you attend some kind of conference in the future. They fit neatly under your badge. If you go to a Comic-Con or whatever, you can find out sort of like who's in on it, who knows what this means, who knows the reference. So if you want to be as cool as these interesting individuals, well, thanks for coming, everybody. This was really fun. I really appreciate you taking some time here and listening to me blabber on about all this stuff. So I'm going to go over here to my box, and I've got sitting cosmonaut badge ribbons if anybody's interested in one. If you are interested in one of my books, I do have those available. I'm a terrible salesman, so I'm just going to leave it at that and say thank you very much for coming. I'm going to stop talking now.